national trend we've spoke about in the past. National trend has been an increasing issue with the opioid and heroin addiction. Has Fond du Lac been seeing that same increase or that same kind of pattern?
Through my first 10 years working in Fond du Lac, I hadn't encountered heroin one time. In approximately 2010, I moved into our street crimes unit investigating drug cases, and but in, I believe it was fall 2010, I dealt with my first overdose investigation in reference to heroin. Within 6 months of that investigation, it was pretty much a daily thing where we were encountering heroin in Fond du Lac, and the trend has just become more and more towards heroin versus prescription pills in the Fond du Lac community. With heroin use, very commonly I see it start with prescription pills. A lot of times prescription pills can be prescribed through an injury that someone suffers from work, and then they become addicted to those prescription medications. When the prescription runs out, a lot of times people look for pills off the streets because they are experiencing withdrawals from that. And when you're buying prescription pills off the streets versus getting them from a pharmacy, it tends to get expensive when you're trying to feed an addiction. So what ends up happening is, as it gets too expensive, the addiction, a lot of times people tend to turn to heroin, which can be a cheaper form of a similar drug to the prescription pills. Typical warning signs to look for, especially with opiate use, a lot of times we see people that lose weight because their need for the drug becomes their sole driving purpose in life. Because once you get to an addiction with heroin or opiate pills, you can't function without that drug because you start going through withdrawals. Heroin and prescription medications have a psychological and physical dependency. So if you don't get that drug, it becomes very difficult to function. Going through withdrawals, the way it's been described to me from common heavy users, it's like the worst flu you can ever imagine. Severe diarrhea, cold sweats, vomiting, and to the point where you can't function in your daily lives. People that I've come across that are heavy users that have gone through recovery and that are currently going through recovery, they basically tell me most of the time their decision to quit using is because they wake up in the morning and they're sick of wondering how they're going to get their drugs, whether it's prescription pills or heroin, just to function that day so they can live and be a productive person. A lot of times people who have addiction, especially to heroin, we see, it's very embarrassing for them because there's such a dirty stigma with heroin use, and a lot of people don't see it for what it is, which it's an addiction that once you're physically addicted to it, it pretty much controls your life because you need it to function. When looking at demographics as to who becomes an addict to heroin or prescription pills, there's not one certain demographic. You can't look at teenagers and say they're the only ones using it. You can't look towards middle-aged men or women that are just using it. We see it across the board used by every age group, financial. We've seen people who are very wealthy on it, people who are poor that have nothing that are using it, that are stealing to support their habit. So there's really not one facet of society that you can look at as being the main source of the opiate or opioid problem in our society. When it comes to using, especially if somebody's injecting, a lot of times people will shoot up in different areas of their body to hide the fact that they're using. The common areas that you hear about people using is shooting up in their areas of their elbow, wrists. Those are areas that are very easy to be seen. If you're wearing a black long sleeve shirt and it's 95 degrees outside, a lot of times people wonder what's going on, why you're wearing that shirt. And a lot of users that use in those places do that to cover up their track marks that they develop over time from injecting. I've seen people that shoot up heroin in between their toes, in between their fingers, basically in every possible spot in their body to hide their use because they're embarrassed of the use, and they don't even want to come out and tell their family members who they trust the most that they're using because of the stigma that there is with heroin use, especially injecting. Using prescription drugs prior to heroin use is a common, phase you could say into, you'd call graduating to heroin. I would say at least half of the heroin users that I've dealt with in my line of work started off using prescription medication, and that may be prescription medication off the streets or prescription medications that they were prescribed by a doctor. The stigma with prescription medications is that they aren't dangerous in our society. You can find the prescription opioid pills like Percocets, Oxycontins. Pretty much any house in the city is going to have that in them because they're prescribed so much for injuries. So it's a dangerous gateway into heroin that I think a lot of young people don't even realize what it can lead to. And a lot of times when somebody gets to the level of physical addiction, it does lead to heroin use. When you look at cost of prescription drugs versus heroin, it is a common factor that I've seen, especially in Fond du Lac. Somebody who's addicted to prescription medication, as they build their tolerance, no matter how they're using it, whether they're taking it orally, if they're snorting it, or if they're injecting it, they build their tolerance, and the prescription pills become too expensive for them to maintain their habit just so they can conduct their regular life, day-to-day activities. So at some point, whether it's through a friend of their own decision, they do go to heroin a lot of times because it is cheaper and it's the same high that you get from prescription medications. In my experiences, it's very common for somebody who is using heroin to also be selling heroin. When somebody is using heroin or even prescription medications, for the matter of fact, they tend to have friends who are also involved in that, and that's for multiple reasons. One of the most common reasons that I see is today, if I'm out of the drug and I need my heroin for the day just so I can take care of my kids or go to work, just be able to function, I may call you and be like, hey, do you have anything that I can borrow from you for the day? I'll pay you back tomorrow. Because a week from now, you may be calling me saying, hey, Nick, do you have anything that I can use? I'm sick today. I need something. I don't have any cash today. So that's very common in running in groups of friends that are all involved in that drug, because they don't want to admit that they have that problem to other people.